See, that's good.
First 30 seconds. I'm sure. You got carries. Like, I've never gotten it. Never. I've never gotten it. Like, how do you mark those? The 1D mark 2 ad. The 1D mark 2. Not my best purchase ever. Yes, this is your color on that. Great. Wonderful. Awesome. I mean, it's not focused. Well, but it was. It happened. When it was right now. When it worked, it was really nice. Really? I got an Xbox. You didn't have to start about the meeting. I'm sure buying it already. Probably grabbed it. 2 minutes. Maybe I want to see how to hear about it. Once in a while, all these adults. Yeah.
Will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
Present.
Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
A quorum is present under the previous order at the hour of 2 p.m., that time arriving, and a quorum have been established. The Senate will proceed to consideration of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, at this time, pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution, the presiding officer will now administer the oath to John G. Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States.
Previous order, the Escort Committee will now conduct the Chief Justice of the United States to the dais to be administered the oath.
Senators, I attend the Senate in conformity with your notice for the purpose of joining with you for the trial of the President of the United States. I am now prepared to take the oath.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws, so help you God?
I do.
God bless you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I will administer the oath to all senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now stand or remain standing and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? The clerk will call the names in groups of 4, and senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
Is recognized.
Any senator who was not in the Senate chamber at the time the oath was administered to the other senators will make that fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible.
The Sergeant in Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, for the information of the Senate, on my behalf and that of the distinguished Democratic leader, I'm about to propound several unanimous consent requests that will assist with the organization of the next steps of these proceedings. They deal largely with necessary paperwork incident to the trial. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the summons be issued in the usual form, provided that the President may have until 6 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020, to file his answer with the Secretary of the Senate, which will be spread upon the Journal, and the House of Representatives have until 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020, to file its replication with the Secretary of the Senate. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document those documents filed by the parties together to be available to all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that if the House of Representatives wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 5 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020. Further, that if the President wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020. Further, that if the House wishes to file a rebuttal brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document all documents filed by the parties together to be available for all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that in recognition of the unique requirements raised by the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, the Sergeant at Arms shall install appropriate equipment and furniture in the Senate chamber during all times that the Senate is sitting for trial with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. The appropriate equipment, furniture, and computer equipment in accordance with the allocations and provisions I now send to the desk and ask that they be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, January the 21st, 2020 at 1 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate, sitting as court of impeachment, is adjourned until Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m.
We're adjourning.
Yeah. Once you go by, I'll go tight. Or maybe he should look wide. I don't know. What do you think?
What did you do?
Maybe. How's your line of sight? Is it better then? Because you're wide. Yeah, you go tight, I'll go wide. You can go wide. What? Yeah, but you're tight. Okay.
You want?
Hold on, they're about there.
This is for the country. Whether you are a Democrat or Republican or progressive or conservative, this is not something that anybody wanted. But we have a constitution, we have a rule of law, and it's absolutely imperative that no president can be above the law, no matter who you are. And if we allow this president to be above the law, it sets a terrible precedent for future presidents and for the future of this country. So I would hope that Senator McConnell allows us to have a full and fair trial. When you have a trial, you hear from witnesses. That's what we do in the United States. And I hope McConnell will allow those witnesses to testify and give us their version of what happened. But while we go forward with this impeachment trial, I hope the American people understand that we have not forgotten that in this country, outside of Washington, D.C. today, there are millions of people who are struggling economically, millions of people who cannot afford their prescription drugs or their health care. And what the Congress of the United States has got to do is chew bubble gum and walk at the same time. We've got to deal with this impeachment trial, but we cannot forget the very serious problems facing the American people.
Are you concerned about how this will affect your campaign?
Yeah, I am. I would rather be in Iowa today. There's a caucus there in 2.5 weeks. I'd rather be in New Hampshire and in Nevada and so forth. But I swore a constitutional oath as a United States Senator to do my job, and I'm here to do my job. And I think the people of the United States understand that.
Senator, have you spoken to Senator Warren since the debate? Have you resolved anything there?
No, we haven't spoken.
What do you think it was a miscommunication that this was?
Look, today I want to Today I want to focus on this very solemn issue.
Senator, do you mind continuing on the mic?
All right, let me grab it here. All right.
It's right there.
All right. Okay, all right. Today is a day we focus on an issue of enormous consequence. It's not a political day, it's a day of solemnity. It's a day of ultimate seriousness. We are beginning a trial for the President of the United States, where very serious allegations have been made from the House that this President has used his power for political purposes in withholding military aid to a foreign country. In other words, in demanding an investigation from that country. So we're at a moment where we have allegations that a president is using a foreign country to undermine American democracy. That is a very, very serious charge. That is what we can, and in my view, must focus on today. Thanks very much.
I said no coming soon, but I'll just say that. Yeah. Bernadette, Pam. Just say we just spoke.
How are you? Good. Good. I think we all know.
This is just all it's a pool camera for
So yeah, just talk in the mic and look at the camera.
if you don't mind.
It is.
We'll just all kind of come this way. Sorry.
Whether you are a presidential candidate or not, senators know what our responsibilities are to the Constitution. And as I've said, for the president to mount a defense to this impeachment. And so far, we've heard nothing except him calling it a witch hunt and continuing to deny all responsibility and continuing to put forth this proposition that he did nothing wrong. Ooh, it's not knocking.
Thank you.